Hi all, good morning. This is Sam. Before we start into the more detailed discussions, probably from the next session onwards, I'll get into an important topic of configuration, which is IBP planning area architecture, right? We will discuss what is IBP planning area architecture. But before that, let's first talk about a simple planning concept. Let us understand what kind of rules exist across domain, right? In terms of business domain, in terms of consulting domain, that's as well. And then probably we will get more clarity. Okay, where do we fit in, right? And if I need to switch roles, what additional skills I probably need to focus on. So this particular training session will not only help you to become a SAP expert, but also will be able to digest more business processes. You will be able to talk more from the business language, right? And if required, you can also switch to different roles within organizations from planning perspective. It could be a demand planner, it could be a supply planner, it could be a regional planner. There are a lot of opportunities also available in the supply chain business domain, right? With a good communication skill, good understanding of business processes, with additional advantage of system exposure, that's also a good career path. I have seen a lot of freshers who learned IBP in recent couple of years. They have got good opportunities in the business domain as well. Like that helps anyway. Okay. Feel free to ask questions. You can put it in chat. If I missed or skip out any question, you can remind me again. There's one more point, both for experience and how teams are structured. Okay, we'll definitely talk about it when implementing the project. What are the typical timelines? Right, good question altogether, right? We will also talk about it. Yeah, I'll talk about a simple network as such, right? So if we look at a typical manufacturing organization, what are we intended to do? We procure certain materials, right? So there is a specific procurement activity happens. What do we procure? Example, we procure some raw materials, to packaging materials as example. We may also source certain finished goods, right? And then directly sell it to the customers, right? A simple trading scenario, right? From the third party sourcing perspective. But in this example, let's keep it simple. Typical manufacturing organization procures raw materials or packaging materials. They keep it in stock and then they produce either semi-finished goods. I use some short forms. Okay. You can say critical assemblies, right? And then they produce finished goods. In business term, you can also call finished good as a SKU, yeah, stock keeping unit. Once you produce this finished good or any raw material, when you receive it, may undergo inspections, right? Quality inspection. So you may have QM department, right? Either for RMs, packaging materials, or SFGs or FGs. Anything, right, which is being received, you may prefer to inspect those, right? Just to make sure that those follow the quality standards. Once you produce these finished goods, you may prefer to store them in your warehouses, right? So we also talk about logistics, right? Where the finished goods would move across your supply chain network. And then we will sell those finished goods to customers. Now, in this case, for a typical organization perspective, a customer can be your distributor, your retailer, or it could be a end customer across the channel altogether, right? Typically, you would find your distributors act as your customers. That's where your supply chain ends. And then from distributor, how the flow happens to retailers or to the end customers, probably you're not bothered about it, right? You may prefer to get that point of sales data for your reference, but your organization's vision is to make sure your distributors are having proper service delivery. I hope so far you're able to relate to these domains, to these SAP modules, what we are talking about. Nothing new here, right? So when we talk about these individual processes, we are aiming towards selling my finished goods to the customers, right? So now let's try to map this as a supply chain network. So let's look at it into the network perspective, right? So for what we have individual distribution centers or depots located in specific areas which are serving my customers. So let's say we have customers here, C1, C2, C3, C4, and so on. I'm trying to keep a simple examples here, guys, because we have a lot of participants probably do not have the overall broader picture of the supply chain networks, right? So these customers in this example are located in my eastern part of the region. Okay. Now, how do I serve these customers? Definitely, I would prefer to serve these customers from the nearest location where the stock would be available, right? That means if I get an order from customer C1, I would prefer to deliver this order from my nearest distribution center, which is DC1. So people who have SD background would be able to relate. Where do I do this mapping? If you go to the customer master, you would see a default plant associated with it, which says, if I get an order for this customer, this is my default plant from where I will ship the goods. This is my default distribution center from which I will ship the goods. Okay? Because this is nearest to the vicinity of these customers. Okay. So we have distribution centers who keeps the goods, keeps the stock of the goods, and then based on the orders, those stocks can be dispatched to those customers. Right? Yeah, I see your questions. We'll come back to those. Let's first focus on the network altogether and let's see how planning function works. Right? So now I understand this is the distribution channel. Individual customers will get their demands fulfilled from a specific location. C3, C4 are based in north, whereas I have a distribution center located in north to fulfill their demands. C5, C6 are based in west. This distribution center in west will be able to fulfill their demands. And C7 and C8 are based in south, as an example, right? These could be a distributors. Or stockists, you can say, right? Now, if I do not have a sufficient stock in these respective distribution centers, what do I do? I need to fulfill this stock from somewhere, right? A typical organization may say that my distribution centers are not that big enough to keep huge inventory. What I would do is probably just to keep the service levels intact, I will keep certain amount of inventory in my distribution centers and maximum of my stock would be stored in my main warehouse. So here you see I have a main warehouse somewhere located around central part of India as example. And if there are shortages in my distribution centers, This warehouse will dispatch the goods to the distribution centers. This warehouse will not dispatch the goods to the customers. Okay, that's how the network is placed. Okay, so for all these four distribution centers, the source is warehouse. In case I have shortage in my distribution centers, I will ask for additional goods from my warehouse. Okay. Again, I'm just thinking from the execution perspective. When I say I will ask, I will execute a stock transport order, a ECC term, right? People with background, with PP background would be able to also relate. With SD background would be also knowing what is STO means, right? From warehouse, I will ship these goods to the distribution center. In case I do not have sufficient stock in my warehouse to fulfill the demand coming from individual distribution centers, what do? I will pass this demand back to my manufacturing plant, right? Where a finished good will be produced. So I have only one manufacturing plant located somewhere in India which produces the goods. However, that manufacturing plant may have certain capacity to store the goods or may not have capacity to store the goods. In that case, the moment I produce it, I ship the goods to the warehouse because warehouse has a bigger storage capacity, and I will stock all the goods there, and then I'll wait for the orders coming from individual distribution centers, right? Now, a finished good would be produced in plant, and I take a simple example. This finished good is made up of raw material 1, raw material 2, and packaging material. Raw material 1 and raw material 2 are sourced from a specific supplier. So I have a vendor 1 who supplies me raw material 1 and raw material 2. And I have vendor 2 who supplies me the packaging materials, right? Most of us would have gone through this simple network scenarios in our SAP exposure, right? The network may be similar, may be different, where probably based on your client uh, ways of working, you may not have a dedicated warehouse. You produce it, probably you ship it directly to the customers. You produce it, ship it to the distribution centers. From there, it goes to the customer. Or you may have multiple warehouses in between. You may have multiple plants in between. But this is how the typical network looks like. Vendor supplies the goods, raw materials to plant. Vendor 2 would also supply the raw packaging material to the plant, right? This is the supply direction. Once plant produces the goods, it will be shipped to the warehouse. Once demand comes to warehouse, based on the actual demand, warehouse will ship the goods to the individual distribution centers. I'm going a bit slow intentionally because some of the people do not have exposure to the network, what we are talking about, right? Some of you probably would have only focused on production execution activities. Some of you have focused on procurement activities. Some of you have focused on sales activities. But this is how a supply chain network would look like. And planning all these demand elements, replenishment elements across the network is part of our supply chain planning scope, right? Nothing complex, right? So far, I think I'm talking about simple concepts, which probably 90% of us already know, right? I'm just trying to create a big picture, what we are going to focus from the planning perspective in the detailed scoping designs or discussions. I take a pause here. Please type in if you have any question. Now you may have questions that fine. I think we understood the network. Now let's focus on the planning part. So what are the planning aspects within this network? Right. Okay. I see one question coming up. Going so good so far. Perfect. So first thing, what we should focus is on the right side. Okay. And for people, if you're aware, on the right side is called as a downstream node. Okay. And extreme left will be the upstream node. Right. So when we will talk about demand flow, here we talked about supply flow, right? The goods movement flow. But how the demand will flow? Demand will flow backwards from the extreme right side to the left side. Demand of distribution center 1, if there is a shortage, will be passed back to the nearest supplying location. Demand of supplying location, which is warehouse 1, will be passed back to the plant and so on, right? So this is downstream node. This is upstream node, right? So that's how probably sometimes when people will talk about this downstream or upstream kind of terminologies, we should be able to relate it, what we are talking about. First thing which is in our focus is how do I predict how much I will be able to sell it to this customer and how much I'll be able to sell it to the rest of the customer, right? That means in an organization, there will be a function to do a prediction, which is called as demand forecasting. Okay? You can call it as demand forecasting, you can call it as forecasting, you can call it as demand planning, everything is same, right? So there will be a dedicated team within your supply chain organization who are focusing on predicting the demand, how much of this specific finished good I am expected to sell it to this customer. Okay. Now, every organization may have different ways of working, right? Some people may say that this is the job of my sales representative. I have a sales representative, Bhupinder, who is based in northern part of India, who is responsible to manage these individual distributors. He visits the distributor location. He has quite good amount of idea how much of inventory is lying in this distributor location, so that we know how much based on the sales what he's executing, how much shortage he may have within specific months, which he might ask us to deliver, right? So some organizations may say salesman is the right person who knows exactly what's happening in my channel. He will be able to predict. That's the most commonly prediction mechanism. Certain organizations which are executing their statistically based demand planning will say that I have a demand planner in my organization who should have exposure to the statistics concepts and should be able to predict the demand based on the sales history, how much I have sold to this customer in my last 3 years, right? So that demand planner will be able to find a trend, will be able to find whether this finished good belongs to what kind of sales mechanism, and will be able to calculate forecast. In statistics world, we call it as a statistical forecast. Okay. So for some of you, this term might be new. Some of you might have heard this term during our education or during our practical experience. Calculation of statistical forecast based on the statistical ways, right, is part of the demand forecasting. Some organizations may say I do not have that kind of function. My sales representative has better idea. His forecasting is quite accurate. I do not need to be worried about statistics algorithms. I'll go with feedback coming from my sales representative or my sales head, right? Or my area sales manager, whatever you call it, right? So this is what happens in the demand forecasting. Demand forecasting talks about this specific area. How much of demand I expect in individual distribution center. Okay. This is a simple concept of demand forecasting. We'll get into a criticalities of demand forecasting, right? When we get into this actual role of demand planner, you will feel that this is a headache. Okay. But let's see how do we come up to those conclusions. There are practical challenges while calculating or predicting the demand, and we need to aware about those parameters which will influence my demand or which will have a demand variability, right? How accurate I am to sense those parameters and adjust my demand forecasting. So people who are trying to also visualize what kind of roles would exist, this is also one of the role would exist in an organization which says a demand planner role. Okay. People with a sales background who are more closer to the execution part of the sales now will be also able to transition their roles as a demand planner from business perspective or demand forecasting consultant from IT perspective. Okay. So when we talk about SAP IBP demand planning concepts, we'll get into the details of how do I configure, set up my demand management component of IBP, right? So far, within an organization, the demand planner's responsibility is to predict the demand at individual distribution centers, how much I should be able to sell it to the individual customers. Okay. Demand planner rules ends there. Once demand planning is done, that means once you have identified for next 2 years or for next 3 years, approximately what is my forecast in each month, how much I should be able to sell it in January, how much I should be able to sell it in February, and so on for next 3 to 5 years as per your periodicity, right? Some organizations will predict this at an individual finished good level. Some organizations will predict it at aggregated level, which could be a product family, product subfamily, it could be a formulation based on the nature of the goods, and then disaggregate that forecast at a finished good level, right? So why I purposefully specified this concept because there is a concept of aggregation and disaggregation, right? Logically, so far you would have understood when I sum up anything becomes my aggregation. When I try to split anything, it will be a disaggregation. Okay. So we'll talk more about aggregation and disaggregation concepts during demand planning sessions. Okay. I'm just trying to keep some hints also here so that we are familiar with the terminologies, right? And some questions might also pop up as part of your curiosity in your mind so that we can cover those in details. Once demand planning activity is done by identifying the forecast for individual products. So what happens is I have an individual forecast here for finished. Let's talk about finished good one, right? So I have individual forecast of finished good one in distribution set, which is let's say 100 pieces. I'll keep it very simple, right? For each distribution center, let's say you identified I should be able to sell 100 pieces from each distribution center. That means your total demand, which you are predicting to sell in the month of February, as example, is 400 pieces. Do I have stock available in my distribution center? So I talk about forecast. And now I talk about stock. Yes, I have certain amount of stock available in my DC1. Probably here I have 20 pieces available. Here I have 100 pieces available. Here I have 200 pieces available. And here I don't have any stock. Okay. Different scenarios, different situations. Okay. Yeah, I'll come back to your question, Bharat. Yeah, valid points. Right. So now what we are talking about is supply planning part of the supply chain planning. Once demand forecasting is done, identifying the demand, netting of that demand against my firm elements like stocks, and finding out shortage. This process is called as a net requirements calculation. Okay. So somebody within your organization should be able to identify this net requirement calculation and say that how much of shortage exists at individual downstream location, which needs to be fulfilled from the supplying location, right? Is a responsibility of your supply plan, right? Now, whatever we are going to talk about is supply planning concept. So let's look at it. So system would identify a shortage of 80 pieces here. There is no shortage here for February month. There is no shortage here. In fact, I have additional stock to cover the demands of further months. And here I don't have any stock, so the shortage is 100 pieces. That means 80 pieces of shortage plus 100 pieces of shortage, 180 pieces of shortage needs to be fulfilled. From where do I fulfill this? From this location which act as a supplying location in my network. In this case, it is warehouse. So warehouse will get two kinds of demands. A demand of 80 pieces coming from DC1 and demand of 100 pieces coming from DC2. What is, so I'm type here is DD1, which is called as a dependent demand. Why it is a dependent demand? Because it's not its own demand, it's coming from some other location within my organization. That's why in planning terms, you may hear this term called as dependent demand. Okay. I'm trying to cover each and every aspects of planning terminologies just for us to become comfortable. Okay. You may feel I'm going slow, but that's how I normally try to prefer, right? I don't want to skip anything. Go slow. For people who have experience, probably it's kind of a revision for them, but for people who are new to supply chain planning, these concepts are important. Once we get into these concepts, we are thorough. So supply planner understands different kind of demand coming in. So total demand within this warehouse is 180. Do I have stock again in this? Again, a net requirement calculation loop gets into run. I have stock of 100 pieces. That means my shortage is 80 pieces. From where do I replenish this stock? This, from planning perspective, from my primary flow perspective, if my warehouse is falling under shortage, it needs to pass the signal to my manufacturing plant, and manufacturing plant should get a signal to produce it. So this shortage of 80 pieces will go back to my manufacturing plant as dependent demand, and the algorithm would again look for any stock available for any existing production order which is already running on my shop floor. If yes, it will net off that demand against these elements. Let's say I don't have any stock, but I already have a production order of 60 pieces running on my shop floor. That means I'm going to produce those 60 pieces. In this case, my shortage would become 20 pieces. So my manufacturing plant should be able to get a signal that my production plan which is called as a planned order of 20 pieces is expected to satisfy those demands. People with ECC background now will be able to relate the transactional elements. This is forecast. This is my stock on hand. When my planning engine will run, it will calculate stock transfer requisitions individually, right? To pass these shortages back to the supplying location, where I would see dependent demand. In terms of ECC, it is also, you would also see it is as a stock transfer release, right? If you look at MD04, stock requirement list transaction code, you again, system will net off that demand against my firm receipt elements, calculate the shortage, identify the source, pass this shortage to the source, net off the demand, calculate the shortage at the source, and then identify what is the procurement type, whether it is internally produced or externally procured, and generate the procurement proposal accordingly. It could be a purchase requisition, it could be a planned order, right? Now, in order to produce this, it will also create a dependent demand for raw material 1, raw material 2, and packaging material. And if there is no stock available in my manufacturing plant, it will generate a purchase requisition for the supplier, right? Based on the netting of the stocks. This is how the entire cycle works. So people who have experience in production, they are familiar with this planned order, production order concepts. People with background are familiar with these purchase requisition concepts, right? But how this purchase requisition is calculated, based on what logic, is derived in my supply chain planning area. So it talks about calculating the stock requirements, calculating the STRs, passing the demand to the supplying location, calculating the net requirements again, passing the demand to the supplying location, calculating the net requirements again, till the extreme upstream location. This part is in the scope of supply chain planner. At times, it is also called as supply planner. Okay. Supply planner, most of the time you would find regional supply planner, because he or she has to plan the entire network, right? So those roles would also be available in my organization to execute this supply chain planning. Yeah. So Rajiv, good questions. I'll come back to that, right? So let me finish this concept of planning. Any question on this topic of net requirement calculations, demand forecasting? Now, you may also have a question that how does system understand that if I have shortage in my distribution center 1, I should pass the demand to warehouse 1 and not pass the demand to DC2? Because from the planning perspective, an organization has to decide what is my flow of demand. Okay. What happens in execution based on the ad hoc situation is an execution part. But from planning angle perspective, we have to decide how the flow of demand will go through. Okay. It may happen that during actual execution, if you have a shortage here, and if your distribution 3, which has a higher stock, is somehow closer to the distribution center 1, so you, in order to cover for the urgency, you may ask these 100 pieces or 80 pieces from distribution center 3 to distribution center 1. But that happens as a actual ad hoc decision-making process during execution. So let us not mix that with planning. From planning perspective, if there is a shortage in distribution center, by default, you should ask the goods from main warehouse. That's how. So whenever an organizational setup is done, we have to be very careful, and supply planners tell us actually what is the flow of demand from planning perspective. And that's how we set this up in system, right? People who have experience in, I think Nishit, you are facing some network issue, so definitely we'll send the recordings to you. Uh, yeah. So people who have experience in ECC now would be able to relate which fields are important here, right? So from supply planning perspective, definitely we are talking about quantity calculation. We are talking about date calculation. We are also talking about identifying the source, right? So we are focusing now on supply planning, and people with MRP experience would be able to relate it. So we are talking about quantity, date, and source determination, right? So there are fields available in my material master in MRP views will influence all this. Where do I indicate for distribution center 1, the source is warehouse? If we visualize the material master MRP3 view, there are two important fields which will help me to understand procurement type and special procurement, right? So in distribution center 1, you would set up procurement type as F, indicating it's an externally sourced. But how do you indicate whether it is externally sourced from a supplier or from a location within your organization? That is derived by the special procurement key. And you would, people with and PP background are more comfortable with this configuration of SPKs, right? Where you define what is the sourcing location. In that case, you will assign a special procurement key which says my source location is warehouse 1. Okay? It could be some numeric number like this. Okay? I'm just giving a hypothetical number. You may create your own Z or SPK to cover all the sources and assign it in the material masters. This is how system derives what is my procurement type and sourcing relationship. The material master at warehouse 1 will have special procurement key indicating my plant is a source. Material master at plant will have procurement type as E because you want system to understand that it is internally produced material and system should create a planned order similar to MRP concepts, right? Any question on this planning network part? So we talked about roles, right? So we talked about roles. So we also mentioned about demand planner role, a supply planner role. From IT perspective, you may have expertise in setting up demand planning. You may have expertise in setting up supply planning, right? So sometimes you may feel a consultant only focusing on demand planning IT part, which is fair, okay? Because there are so many things within demand planning which a person would prefer to have expertise with. And another person who would focus on supply planning part, right? The moment you start having a lot of, deep exposure to planning concepts, you may have a cross-domain expertise as well within the supply chain planning. There is third angle of the planning part, which is in the short term, you also cover the production planning part, which is production planning. Supply planner is more focused from mid-term to long-term perspective. But within a bucket of 1 week to 3 weeks or 4 weeks, your organization may prefer to have a firm plan because you need to also deal with your raw materials availability, your machine availability, which is called as a work center or resource or labor, right? So you need to work, you as an operational planner, as a production planner, need to work closely with your manufacturing plant execution team who exactly knows the availability of those specific resources, right? So you may say that, okay, fine, I'm expecting to produce 20 pieces for this finished good. However, when you talk with your shop floor team, they may tell you that it's not possible. Our machine is going to be in downtime. Our labor are not going to be available. I have some supply constraint from a raw material perspective. Although we have a vendor one, but there is a downtime at a vendor side also. So there is a bottleneck in the real world, and that's why we will not be able to produce these 20 pieces. So accordingly, you will make sure your production plans are already firm in specific period of short term, okay, which is in the range of 1 week to 3 weeks normally, right? It can also cover up to 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and so on based on the organizational ways of working. But then, in order to work in that fashion, on Monday, what do I need to produce? On Tuesday, what do I need to produce? At that level, Monday morning first shift, what we need to produce. Monday second shift, what I need to produce. At that level, it's at a detailed level of operations. That function is covered under production planning. So you will have a separate master production scheduler or master operational planner as a role available in your organization for production planning activities. Okay. So now we started having a link of what kind of different roles available in the supply chain domain, right? And how do I now start looking for getting skilled in those specific areas? Okay. Now people who have probably around 15 years of SAP APO experience, probably why not? Let me also see if I have a bigger roles available in the actual business domain, right? That's also possible. You may also get a role of regional planner or a head of planning activities from S&OP, etc., right? Demand planner, from time granularity perspective, you would focus on monthly buckets for mid to long term. Supply planner normally would focus on weekly buckets, identifying, aggregating your weekly demands and work on the shortage calculation in the weekly buckets. But again, from mid-term to long-term horizon. Whereas production planner is not only doing the detailing at day level, but even at minutes and hour level planning, right? But only in the short period, okay, of 1 to 3 weeks as an example. Okay. Now you also got an idea of at what time granularity I should be able to focus, right? Till what periodic horizon. Then there can be also a role of material planner, who is responsible to identify those demands of raw materials and work with the vendors, right? So person who is responsible or probably working in MM area would be able to closely relate this activity, right? Where we talk about creation of purchase requisitions and then converting it into purchase orders. So this would be also on a day or weekly level, right? From mid to long term also. That's the purpose of the purchase requisition creation. In the short term horizon, you would have already aligned on the demands and you would have already raised purchase orders, right? So some people who have a procurement department, within that procurement department, people would work on the planning concept, are more focused as material planners. And there might be some people who are only focusing on identifying vendors. That means vendor evaluations or following up on the actual order with vendors or deciding the prices, right? So that activity is part of the actual execution. But from the quantity calculation, predicting the raw materials demand and following up with vendors is responsibility of material planner. So there are multiple opportunities available if you want to focus on any business roles in the actual supply chain organization. And so far, you would have come across all such kind of roles, all such kind of business terminologies, huh, within your existing experience, right? I hope I was able to give you a good amount of picture. We will be using similar examples when we talk about detailing of demand planning or supply planning. So when we talk about all those supply planning concepts, how does this algorithm works? This picture should come in your mind, right? How do I pass on the demands across the network and calculate my replenishment proposals? STRs are my replenishment proposals. Planned order is my replenishment proposal, right? Same names, right? Or maybe same term meanings, different names. Some people call it as STR, some people call it as replenishment proposal, some people may call it as procurement proposal in business terms, right? Any question so far or anything which you want to build on top of this, just type in. Now, when we talk about IBP, we will talk about different modules within IBP, right? So as a SAP PP consultant, SAP consultant, when I was learning those modules, what did I focus? I focused on, first of all, what is this business process of production execution? Okay. Then I also focused on what is the master data requirements within that production process? What is the configuration required in order to execute that business process in system? And then I also focused on the integration part. How does PP and are linked together? How does PP and costing is linked together? Or how does PP and logistics or warehousing is linked together, right? So similarly, here also we'll try to focus on first, importantly, business planning process. If it's a demand planning, how does demand planning happens? What is the master data requirements from demand planning perspective? If I need to set up demand planning in IBP, what is the configuration required? And since IBP is a isolated tool, how do I integrate this master data and transactional data from different systems? What is the integration mechanism, right? That's how we'll try to focus. I'm pretty sure when you will get into a deep dive of IBP, you will start liking supply chain planning more because there are so many various parameters which influence these planning concepts. And then you would feel that ECC was comparatively easy because it was more related to configuration. Here, it is more related to thinking the solution design and modeling that design, right? Configuration is very easy part. How do you come up with a solution approach? That is very important. Bharat, your question on multiple source mapping possible? Definitely yes. Multiple sourcing is possible, right? How do we manage that? We will look into it during the supply planning deep dives. Whether to manage the multiple sourcing part of planning is a debatable question. Every organization takes that call based on the complexity of those networks, but yes, it is possible, right? As an IT consultant, what we try to aim is we try to keep the solution as simple as possible so that it is sustainable and understood by the planners. Otherwise, planners would reach out to us every now and then to understand or to ask questions that how does system propose this quantity? I don't understand this calculation. Can you explain me? And then we will spend a lot of time in troubleshooting and justifying the quantity calculation, right? That's why it's very important for us to keep the planning situation as standard as possible and only those exceptional scenarios try to map it in planning, right? Otherwise, keep it simple in ECC MRP. or S4 MRP, right? I'm just taking a pause. Yeah, that's a valid statement. Yes. I'm just taking a pause and see. Okay, what role conflict between supply planner and demand planner? There is no role conflict as such. Demand planner is more focusing on predicting a demand. So that is the objective of demand planner. How accurately he can predict a demand for my individual finished goods across my portfolio, across my network, which is my location facing the customer. That's it. Then netting that demand with stocks, with firm elements, calculating the shortage, passing those demands to the upstream nodes, etc., is the supply planner's responsibility. So there is no conflict of role as such here, but there is a handshake. Okay. And we'll talk about this handshake in S&OP process, sales and operations planning process, where how does demand and supply handshake happens, right? And you would realize, yes, definitely there are conflicts happen in the discussions. A lot of debates happen in S&OP, but there is no ambiguity from the roles expectation perspective. Okay, there is a specific definition of role of demand planner and specific role definition for supply planner. Does IBP has a capacity to create transaction like STR, STO, or purchase equation based on the demand? So I'll start from the beginning. Okay, in ECC we have a concept of MRP. MRP has a functionality to calculate STRs, purchase equations, or planned orders, right? Because it is able to identify those elements, which is called as order-based planning. Okay, so we are now you will hear this term newly. I'm talking about difference between order-based planning and time-based planning or time series planning. So order-based planning will be able to derive what is this element all about. Is it planned order? Is it purchase equation? Or is it stock transfer equation? MRP has that capacity. APO, people having experience in APO who have worked on SNP module, supply network planning module, they will also confirm that yes, APO also has this functionality of deriving what is STR, what is purchase equation, what is planned order. When we talk about IBP, in IBP, there are two concepts. One is time series planning, one is order series planning. In time series planning of supply module, system is not able to identify whether it is STR, planned order. It is only able to identify quantity and in which bucket. That's it. Okay, which is more closer to. But if you want to calculate or derive whether it is STR, PR, then you have to implement response and supply module of IBP, right? Which helps you to come up with these planned order purchase equation elements. Okay. In our curriculum, we focus more on time series. Order-based planning concepts will cover. Order-based planning of IBP is not yet mature. SAP is still trying to, evolve that module. There are certain clients which have started implementing it. But for us, the focus would be understanding the planning concept, time series algorithms, what are different algorithms provided by SAP in time series, right? And then we'll also touch base on what is different between time series and order-based planning, right? There was a question on the Excel sheet. Let me also. Okay, so Kiran was saying, can you take Excel cell DC1 at top and hide G cell so that we can take a screenshot? Okay, let me do that. You want me to hide a G cell? And then you want me to scroll up. Okay. Yeah. I just put this way. Okay. And Kiran, I don't think you may need to take a screenshots also because this recordings would be available, right? Whenever you want. But yeah, it's up to you. Okay, go back to the questions. Right. So, but saying dependent demand, we know what's dependent demand, what is independent demand. Independent demand could be forecast. FG is, yeah, perfect. So FG is finished good. So for finished goods, since we are talking about forecast, demand forecasting, in distribution center one, the forecast which is shown on distribution center one, you can also call it as independent demand because this demand is derived for specific customers, right? For finished goods, demand at warehouse can be dependent demand. For finished goods, demand at plant can also be dependent demand. Whereas demands for components in plants can be also dependent demands. So when you talk about independent demand, dependent demand concepts, you can now relate it, right? If I'm looking this demand for this material at this specific location, whether I should call it as independent or dependent, right? And you rightly indicated APO is more mature from the STR PR calculation perspective. And as a roadmap for APO succession, SAP is now prioritizing this to map it in IBP, right? So in recent future, you'll start, a lot of clients would be also transitioning from SAP APO to SAP IBP response and supply model. Okay. I think there is a question on the optimizer concept. Definitely, we will cover that. We may not have a demos covering optimizer because it's a wider scope, but we should understand what is difference between heuristics and optimizer as an algorithm concept. Definitely, we'll cover those parts, right? From the conceptual understanding perspective. Question coming is how IBP will help my career as I'm into ABAP. My simple take on this is, irrespective of your existing exposure, whether you are ABAP, whether you are basis, doesn't matter. If you understand the supply chain planning concepts very well, you can be into supply chain planning. I have seen a basis consultant in my team who matured enough to take up the planning uh, part, and now he's one of the domain lead. He's one of the uh, COE lead in one of the organization now, right? And he's excellent in the functional understanding. So it is up to us how we capture it, how we grasp it. People who have a ABAP experience are good in visualizing the technicalities of the solutions, right? So that also helps. It is not only restricted to AP or PP guys. I have seen SD consultants switching over to IBP. I have seen MM consultant, PP consultant switching over to IBP. And nowadays, the trend is people with engineering background or MBA background, just freshers out of college, are also able to grasp IBP very easily because the tool is so customizable, lot of documentation is available. The only part what we should focus is we should also try to understand its integration with our ECC. And people with ECC experience grab it faster than people who are freshers from colleges. That's the only difference. The advantage of learning IBP for experienced people is they don't need to jump into a configuration related roles. They get a better roles from the organization perspective where you are expected to do a lead kind of roles while driving the workshops, while driving the solution designs, right? Acting as an overall cutover lead and so on. Right? That's how it is very important. Relation to SSE. SSE is a SAP Analytic Cloud solution uh, recommended by SAP from reporting perspective. You can say in a way SSE and IBP both could be similar, both could be different altogether. SSE is more focused only on reporting. IBP is more focused on planning. And when I say planning, it also gives you a functionality of reporting. So simple views which are required from planner, you may decide to have those in IBP. But a fancy reports, you may decide to model those in SSE, BW, or any other web tools like Click and so on. Right? Nowadays, MIUs are also in demand. Right? So SSE is more focused on reports. IBP is not only reporting, right? It's how you generate plan. And to generate plan, you need a front end, which is an Excel front end for us, which you can format it as a report. Right? Do we learn solution design, requirement mapping, best practices? Definitely, yes, that's the focus, right? Because our focus is not to show you, you go to this specific SPRO and do this configuration. Person with good amount of SAP knowledge, he or she will be able to do that easily. Our focus is to learn how do I become a supply chain planning expert? How do I drive the design workshops? How do I understand the requirements and visualize how this requirement can be easily modeled and then come up with the solution options, right? So, Venkat, the SSE planning module is not designed from the supply chain organization perspective, right? There is bit of planning concept, but it's more related to reporting part, right? Similarly, you may also debate SAP is also in olden days, SAP also used to recommend BPC, right? But that was also a reporting tool more from the financial perspective. That was also planning tool, but more from the financial perspective. SAP's recommendation, if your organization is supply chain driven, if your organization has concepts of demand forecasting, new product introductions, supply chain planning, distribution requirements planning, then you go for IBP. SAC doesn't support all those kind of concepts, right? SAC is more into modeling, right? But person having an SAC experience can switch into IBP because he has a background of modeling. He or she knows how to model those requirements and generate a data views in IBP. Right? SSC will not give you an idea of how net requirement calculation happens. No, it won't give an idea. Yeah. Right? Now, I also talked about distribution requirement planning now when I was giving this example, but I did not discuss this when I was talking about a network, right? So what is this distribution requirement planner role? It is called as DRP, distribution requirements planning. Basically, when we were talking about net requirement calculation, we were talking about backward calculation from my location, which is customer facing location, to my warehouse, to my plant, and to my vendor. However, distribution requirement planner is focused only in the short term to understand how much of goods I should be distributing to distribution center 1, 2, 3, and 4 based on my firm elements, right? And that is a short-term focus. Okay, I understand this was the focus, how much was the shortage, etc., etc. Supply planner has done his work. But in reality, production plant, instead of producing 20 pieces, because of the economic lot sizing calculation, production plant has produced 200 pieces as an example. So I have stock available of 200 pieces in my warehouse. How do I distribute that? If I have a situation where my demand is more, but my supply is less, how do I distribute it? If I have excess supply, how do I distribute it? Those kind of questions would come in scope of distribution requirement planner. Okay. So there is a DRP concept. People having exposure to APO, they would also relate this to a DRP submodule within SNP, right? Right now in IBP, we don't have this DRP module as part of the time series function. SAP has built it for order-based planning, right? But right now, people are still using APO for DRP. So when we go into a deep dives, we will try to also understand what is IBP used for as of now and how SAP is aiming IBP to be used for in the recent future. SAP's aim is by 2027, APO has to be obsolete and all the functionalities have to be transition to IBP. Okay. You will see when we will start using IBP, configuration part, we will use web-based URL. But from planner's view perspective, we will always use Excel. That means we have two kinds of navigations, right? When we say navigation, a front end for IBP. One is Excel based, one is web based. Why Excel based? I think we covered it in our previous session. When SAP was trying to build this tool, S&OP was the primary focus. Sales and operations was the primary focus. And sales and operations planning, most of the organizations were using offline Microsoft Excel tools for that. So SAP said that since planners are more comfortable with Excel as a front end, why not utilizing this idea? And it will be an easy win for us to sell this tool to them, because then from the front end perspective, there is no change management. So that's how IBP, started getting involved. Excel was identified as a preferred front end, but for certain functionalities, SAP said is you can still use web-based URL and carry out the planning function. So we'll see what is the difference between Excel based and web-based during the deep dives, right? We will get comfortable with both front ends. Right. So what is the difference between IBP bundle course and only IBP course? I think Bhupendra will, yes, revert it back, right? In IBP course, we only go through those self-learning videos, but the bundle course has additional features associated with it. Right. So far, I think we got good amount of curiosity to understand how this overall supply chain planning happens. What are different modules within supply chain planning? When I talk about demand planning function, what could be the detailing that I need to learn? When Sam was talking about new product introduction, what is it all about? Right? How is it related to demand planning? All this detailing will happen in the demand planning sessions. We will understand demand planning separately. We will understand supply planning separately, but we have to thorough with our sales and operations planning process, which is a core of IBP. So we will also understand how demand planning and supply planning is part of the sales and operations planning. Other than that, the different stakeholders of sales, marketing, finance, how do they influence the supply chain calculations? Part of the S&OP, right? And then how does the operational plan gets calculated? Apart from that, a new topic of rules and authorizations. So far in our ECC world, this topic used to be covered by our technical team, our basis or security team. Here, the entire design of rules and authorization lies in IBP consultant's hand. So we'll understand how this designing happens. How do I configure the rules and authorizations, right? When I'm using IBP as a planning tool, I need additional intelligence, additional supporting hands in terms of exceptions, in terms of alerts. How do I manage those alerts? Okay. And that will help me to decide or having a decision-making process of quantity or date calculations, right? So planning is more about determining right amount of quantity and determining right date from demand and from supply perspective. If we get these concepts clear, we'll be able to easily talk about planning concepts with a business planner in his own terms, right? And we will be able to easily elaborate how I'm going to configure this setup to cover this business requirement, which has to be understood by you and which should be sustainable, so that after implementation, probably I'll be out, but you should be thorough as a super user or as a end user. with this planning process. Right? I take a pause here, right? And then in next session, we'll start getting into actual IBP screens. And our first primary focus would be understanding what is the high level architecture of IBP, where we will talk about a lot of new concepts, new terminologies like attributes, key figures, planning area, planning level. If we are thorough with those concepts, we are able to design any solution within S&OP, demand and supply. Right? Demand is more customizable. You can configure client-specific demand planning, but supply planning, we normally focus on SAP standard building blocks. Because supply planning concepts are standard, nobody tries to come out of any exceptional business requirements. But how do we model that supply planning is a skill, right? Which master data parameters which are going to influence that supply planning, we need to be aware of, and we need to manage this master data as part of the uh, project implementation. Right? Okay, I take a pause here, see if there are any questions, you can type in, and then I look forward for further enrollments, and we'll start the next sessions from Saturday onwards. You can copy all the links what Bhupender is sharing with us, and I hope with this training, you also have an option of getting system access. So you can, I would recommend you choose that, right? System access would be important. But in case if you do not choose it, I think we'll have to rely on the sessions what we're covering. Yeah. So Mahesh, your question is valid, right? You're not sure about the IBP scope. Now, if I try to give you a picture, over the periods, most of the clients were using SAP APO. Okay, and it's a very mature tool which was built by SAP over the years, right? Now, since SAP APO is getting obsolete, clients have to migrate to some other tools from planning perspective. So there are competitors of SAP, but there are challenges that they might have difficulties in integration, right? So SAP is bringing this IBP tool as a common tool to carry out all your demand planning, supply planning, S&OP processes altogether. So far, if I give a reality, S&OP is most widely used within IBP, and demand planning and supply planning time series part is mostly used. Okay. And in addition to that, SAP says because we are talking about S&OP, you need alert mechanism, exception mechanism, you need KPIs to be monitored. So you have a control tower module, right? Order-based planning is the only area where SAP is trying to evolve that, right? Otherwise, rest of the areas are quite stable. And market of IBP is huge. Now, if you talk about any big organization, they are using IBP either for any of this functionality or most of the functionalities, right? Whereas from order-based planning perspective, there are, I think, competitors in market who are trying to sell their products like Kinaxis, OMP and all, right? And yes, I mean, SAP is trying to put their uh, order-based planning part as stable as possible, and they're trying to prioritize that. But over the period, I'd see S4 is by default choice for execution. And if that's the case, most of the clients would turn into IBP for successor to APO.
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for this course. I have a couple of questions. Maybe I mentioned them early in the chat, but it's just a repetition. Like, how do you find it when it comes to, say, North American or European markets, like dealing with the clients? What kind of structure is there in the teams? Is something that I wanted to understand based on your experience. And I also wanted to understand what is uh, AMS, is there a solution which is like a ticketing system like Jira or ClickUp? I don't know. Like, is it one of the popular tools when it comes to SAP IBP implementations, or how the ticketing and solutioning or solution manager things? And post-implementation support is implemented. Just wanted to understand these.
Right. Right. So but I'll take your second question first. So regarding AMS, regarding the ticketing tool, right? So IBP is one of the execution from the planning perspective. Ticketing perspective, I have seen tools called as Jira, HPLM. You talk about Snow. Those are the ticketing tools, right? Even solution manager we use for the documentation purpose, but those are independent of IBP. I mean, if I'm an IBP end user and if I come across any issue which needs to be escalated to my support team, I will use this tool to elaborate the issue, and then the rest of the automation happens. So IBP and those ticketing tools are independent. I mean, it's the same case with your ECC or S4 model. If I'm an execution person, have an issue, I will use those ticketing tools from the supporting execution perspective. But if you are asking for any integration as such, there are no integrations. There are no automations.
If I remember correctly, maybe like ECC had this solution manager built in or something like that.
So, I mean, ECC doesn't have a solution manager built in as such. Solution manager is a totally different system altogether where you can map your individual processes and map your respective design documents, right? In terms of BPR, in terms of solution design, in terms of user stories, etc. Right? Similar thing you can also manage with IBP. There's no integration between ECC
Okay.
and solution manager as such. And similarly, there's no integration between IBP. But let's say you are a planner and or maybe you belong to a planning community, you identify your level 1 to level 5 processes between supply chain planning, then demand planning, supply planning. Within demand planning, you have sub processes and so on. And during implementation, you can use solution manager to document all, right? And as part of your post go live mechanism also, you can use solution manager to cover up the documentation. Right. Coming back to the first question of clients in Americas or even in Europe, the structure would be still same. I mean, if you're part of the implementation project, there would be a lead roles who would act as a overall lead for supply chain perspective, who would be able to drive the workshops, work with the individual module leads to come up with the agenda, come up with the prototyping or solution demo workshops, right? Identify fit gap analysis and so on. So there are multiple roles within the implementation, similar to your ECC world, right? You will also come across different roles in IBP implementations. And
Okay.
I have also
And
seen clients within Europe or Americas are also focus more on processes. So you would see lot of roles coming up as part of their project pipeline for change management, for trainings, end user trainings, demand analyst, so on. So those people who have experience of system, who understands business process, are also able to get such kind of roles.
okay, got it. And just wanted to understand the Kator part of it. Like, is it like as simple or as complex as
It is
HANA, ECC to
it
HANA, or
it
it's,
is as
yeah,
simple as possible because we are talking about Excel fronted, right? So SAP has provided a lot
okay,
of functionalities to load the data via flat files. Very easy. Yeah.
okay. So,
Right.
yeah, those were the key questions. If you had anything like,
Right. So that you brought up a good point. I may add this also as a one of the topic in our training curriculum for the cutover activities. Right. I'll cover that.
because that is one of the important aspects
Definitely. We normally cover
when
it
it
as
comes
part of the
to,
implementation phase discussions, but
okay.
exactly we will simulate if I'm going through a business go live, what all cutover activities one should think over.
And as a part of this course, do we get any standard templates in terms of data gathering and then cutover management checklists and stuff like that, or we
We
have to build on
don't,
our own?
yeah, I mean, based on the knowledge, definitely at the end of the sessions, you will be able to build it. I mean, we don't provide those as such, but we will cover those during the discussions, right? But I don't have a standard templates created just to be shared with. But based
Yeah,
on during
kind
the
of
discussions, we
boiler
will.
port. Yeah.
Right.
Because if there are like simple boilerplate templates, then maybe we can expand them on them and then like take it to actual implementation part.
Right. So I would
And one,
suggest, yeah, I would suggest during the sessions itself when we'll cover those points, right? I would request individuals to take those notes. I mean, we may not be able to provide the templates as such, but with the idea of discussion, whatever we have, right? We get those points, and then we are able to come up with those key design templates.
okay. So, and just wanted to understand even this trend, what I'm seeing nowadays is like companies are moving away from these big firms and then trying to, deal with kind of small boutique consultants or independent consultants. How is that working in IBP world? Just wanted to
Yeah,
understand. Is it like, are
it's
there
not
big
easy.
players dominant?
No, only big players are dominating.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. No. For us, the aspiration is clear, right? Whoever
If
implements
I
IBP, I want to be IBP expert, right? Then I will be in demand, whether it's a big firm or a small firm or as an individual freelancer, right? So our focus is clear. Yes. I think we had a good interactive sessions. People who have enrolled so far, probably they are clear. People who still have some doubts, do not hesitate to talk to Bhupender, get some clarity. If required, he'll pitch me in, right? Now, so far you understood the way I'm going to drive these sessions, right? It has to be with the equipped pace. I don't want to rush it around. I don't want to only focus on specific configurations. I want to have a complete picture of a planner's hat and then make sure we understand business terminology. How does planning happens in business? And then how do I configure it or model it using IBM, right? So let's hope we have a good interactive sessions going forward, and I'll talk to you next week. Thank you all.